two of North America's busiest trade corridors, used a funnel through a single aging bridge built in 1929. Canada decided the fix wasn't patching that bridge. It was building an entirely new one, tall enough for ocean-going ships to pass beneath it, with a main span so long it doesn't need a single pier touching the water. This is the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Twin towers rising 220 meters over the Detroit River. 216 individual cable stays holding up the deck. The longest cable-stayed span in North America. And a border crossing that took 7 years to build, and then sat completely finished for almost 2 months before either government would actually let traffic cross it. Here's the part that sounds almost unbelievable. This bridge finished construction, passed every inspection, and then sat closed. Not because anything was wrong with the structure, because two national governments couldn't agree on how to split the toll revenue. A record-setting piece of engineering, fully built, fully tested, sitting dark over an international river, while the actual argument played out entirely on paper somewhere else. Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, sit directly across the Detroit River from each other, and for decades, the vast majority of truck traffic between Canada and the United States funneled through a single privately owned crossing built back in 1929. A bridge never designed to handle the sheer volume of modern trade moving between the two countries every single day. Planners began pushing for a second, publicly owned crossing years before any construction starts, eventually settling on a location just south of that aging bridge, close enough to connect directly into the existing highway networks on both sides. Interstate 75 on the Detroit side, Highway 401 on the Windsor side. The project gets named after Gordie Howe, the hockey legend who spent 25 seasons with the Detroit Red Wings and became one of the most recognized figures straddling both sides of the border the bridge is meant to connect, a naming choice announced years before a single foundation gets poured. Construction officially begins in June of 2018, with a consortium called Bridging North America selected to design, build, finance, and eventually maintain the crossing under a long-term agreement with the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, the Canadian Crown Corporation overseeing the project. From the very beginning, the design settles on a cable-stayed structure rather than a suspension bridge or a conventional multi-span design, a choice driven partly by long-term maintenance considerations and partly by a hard requirement that emerges early in planning. The Detroit River beneath the crossing needs to stay completely clear of piers because large cargo vessels regularly pass beneath this exact stretch of water, and a conventional bridge relying on piers sunk into the riverbed would either obstruct that shipping traffic or need to be built at a scale far beyond what the project could justify. Before either tower can rise, engineers first have to solve the foundation problem. And on a river this size, that means reaching bedrock reliably enough to anchor 2 towers each, carrying an enormous share of the bridge's total load. Crews sink deep foundation elements down through the riverbed sediment until they reach solid bedrock, roughly 36 meters below the surface, anchoring each tower's base more than 100 feet into rock stable enough to trust with 220 meters of concrete and steel rising above it. Getting that foundation work right becomes one of the most consequential early milestones on the entire project, since a shortfall here would compromise everything built on top of it for the rest of the bridge's operational life. Testing and verifying every foundation element takes months on its own, since engineers can't simply assume the bedrock below one section of riverbed behaves identically to bedrock 100 meters away. Core samples get drilled and analyzed at multiple points across both tower footprints before construction crews commit to a final foundation design. And once the deep foundation elements are actually in place, load testing confirms each one can bear its calculated share of tower weight before construction on the visible tower structure is allowed to begin above it. With foundations complete, tower construction begins in earnest, and it's here that the design becomes something more than purely functional. Both towers get shaped deliberately to echo the curve of a hockey stick, captured mid-slap shot. A nod to the bridge's namesake worked directly into the structural geometry rather than tacked on as decoration afterward. Each tower climbs in stages, using slip-form or jump-form techniques, similar to those used on other tall concrete structures, pouring, curing, and rising section by section, rather than requiring scaffolding built from the ground up for the entire height at once. By the time each tower tops out, it reaches roughly 220 meters, or about 722 feet, tall enough to rank among the tallest structures in the entire region, just shy of Detroit's own Renaissance Center towers, standing nearby on the riverfront skyline. Anchor boxes get installed along the upper sections of each tower during construction, precisely positioned steel fittings that will eventually receive and secure the cable stays radiating down to the deck below. Every single anchor point calculated in advance to distribute the deck's load evenly across the tower's full height. Climbing a tower this tall on either side of an active international river means every crane, every concrete pour, and every worker on the structure has to account for weather conditions that can shift quickly over open water. Wind speed monitoring runs continuously throughout tower construction, with lifts and pours paused whenever conditions exceed safe thresholds, since a crane operating at height on a partially completed tower has far less margin for error than the same crane working at ground level. Winters along the Detroit River bring their own complications too, with cold weather concrete curing procedures and heated enclosures used to keep pours on schedule through months, where ordinary outdoor concrete work would otherwise have to stop entirely. With both towers standing, attention shifts to the deck, and building a deck this long without a single pier in the water calls for a specific, methodical construction technique known as balanced cantilever construction. Rather than building the deck from one end to the other, crews extended outward from each tower in both directions simultaneously, adding matched segments on either side at the same time, so the load stays balanced around the tower at every stage of construction. Every time a cable gets installed on one side of a tower, its opposing cable on the other side gets installed immediately afterward, because leaving one side of the deck supported while the other waits would let the whole structure tip out of alignment before construction ever finishes. Each new deck segment gets pre-stressed once it's in place, tensioning internal steel strands running through the concrete to put the segment into a permanent state of compression before the next segment gets added on top of it. That sequence: pour a segment, install matched cables on both sides, pre-stress the segment, then move on to the next one, repeats over and over as the deck extends further out from each tower toward the center of the river, until the two advancing halves of the bridge finally meet in the middle. Every stage of that cantilevering process gets checked against precise survey measurements before crews move on to the next segment, because a small error compounded across dozens of segments extending out from a tower can add up to a serious misalignment by the time the two advancing deck sections are supposed to meet in the middle of the river. Engineers track deflection at the tip of each cantilever constantly as new segments and cables get added, adjusting cable tension in small increments to keep the whole structure sitting exactly where the design calls for it to be, rather than simply hoping the accumulated small errors cancel each other out by the time the gap finally closes. That meeting point becomes its own milestone, marked with a topping out ceremony once the final segment closes the gap and the deck becomes one continuous structure spanning the entire river. By the time the two towers and the deck between them are complete, the main span stretches 853 meters, the longest cable-stayed span anywhere in North America and the 10th longest of its kind anywhere on the planet. An extraordinary superlative for a crossing built primarily to move commercial trucks and daily commuters, rather than to serve as a tourist landmark in its own right. Supporting that deck are 216 individual cable stays, high-strength steel strands bundled together and anchored at precisely calculated points along both towers and the deck itself, engineered collectively to carry the deck's full weight without a single support touching the water below. Underneath the deck, A clearance of roughly 46 meters remains open for shipping traffic to pass through freely, exactly the requirement that ruled out a conventional multi-pier design from the outset. Beyond the main span itself, the completed crossing includes extensive approach infrastructure on both sides of the border. Modernized ports of entry, expanded inspection facilities, and realigned local roadways connecting the new bridge directly into the existing interstate and highway networks on each side. The finished project includes 60 separate Canadian and American inspection lanes, combined with 16 toll lanes, alongside 6 full vehicle travel lanes across the main span itself, and a dedicated multi-use path for pedestrians and cyclists running the entire length of the crossing, something the original 1929 bridge never offered at all. Throughout construction, the project also commits to direct engagement with Canadian Indigenous communities near the Windsor side of the crossing, along with integrated public art and local road improvements built into both the Windsor and Detroit approach zones, treating the surrounding neighborhoods as part of the project rather than simply the leftover space around a bridge. Originally scheduled to take 74 months and finish by the end of 2024, construction ultimately runs longer, pushed by pandemic-era delays, supply chain disruption, and the sheer complexity of a project this size. The bridge is finally completed, inspected, and cleared in early June of 2025 at a final contract cost of roughly $6.5 billion Canadian dollars, financed almost entirely by the Government of Canada, despite the crossing being jointly owned between Canada and the state of Michigan, making it, by a wide margin, the largest single infrastructure project the Canadian government has ever undertaken. Then, remarkably, nothing happens. Invitations go out for an opening ceremony scheduled for mid-June. The day before that ceremony, the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority calls it off entirely, with no new date announced, citing unresolved issues between the two national governments. What follows is roughly 7 weeks, where a fully built, fully inspected, 6-lane international bridge simply sits closed, its towers and deck complete, its cables tensioned, its inspection lanes ready, while officials in Washington and Ottawa negotiate over how toll revenue from the crossing will actually be divided between the two countries, a dispute that becomes tied up in broader trade discussions between the two governments at the time. The disagreement finally resolves in mid-July, with both governments announcing an opening date shortly afterward. For a project defined almost entirely by engineering superlatives, that 7-week stretch stands out precisely because it has nothing to do with engineering at all. Every physical test the bridge needed to pass, structural inspections, load ratings, cable tensioning verification, had already been completed and signed off on weeks earlier. The delay existed entirely on the financial and political side of the project, a reminder that even a border crossing engineered to a 125-year design life still ultimately answers to an agreement between two governments before a single vehicle can use it. On July 27, 2025, the Gordie Howe International Bridge officially opens to vehicle traffic, with the dedicated pedestrian and cycling path following roughly a week later. It becomes the first new crossing built between Ontario and Michigan in more than 60 years, engineered for a service life stretching 125 years into the future, designed from the outset to handle a volume and scale of cross-border trade that the aging 1929 bridge nearby was never built to manage. 2 towers shaped like hockey sticks, mid-slap shot, anchored more than 100 feet into bedrock beneath one of the busiest trade rivers in North America. 216 cables holding up a deck that stretches over 800 meters without a single pier touching the water below it. A construction sequence that had to keep both halves of an advancing deck in perfect balance for years, segment by segment, until the two sides finally met in the middle of the river. And in the end, an engineering achievement finished months ahead of the political agreement needed to actually let a single car drive across it. The stakes behind that engineering are worth putting in perspective. The Windsor-Detroit corridor this bridge serves has, for decades, carried a disproportionate share of all trade moving between Canada and the United States, with billions of dollars in goods crossing the river every single day on trucks bound in both directions. A single incident on the old 1929 bridge, a closure, an accident, routine maintenance, could ripple through supply chains on both sides of the border within hours, since there was never a comparable alternative crossing capable of absorbing that volume of traffic on short notice. Giving that corridor a second, modern, higher capacity crossing was never framed by either government as simply a convenience for commuters. It was framed as redundancy for one of the most economically important border crossings on the entire continent, a piece of infrastructure important enough that even a 7-week political standoff over toll revenue couldn't be allowed to drag on indefinitely once trade considerations pushed both governments back to the table. If you want to see which megastructure we take apart next, hit subscribe. We're just getting started.